All right, let's talk about a book that's probably one of the most infamous, most misunderstood guides to power ever written. Machiavelli's The Prince. You've definitely heard of it, but today we're not just going to look at what it says, we're going to dig into the why. What was the desperate reality that led him to write this thing in the first place?
So here's the thing you have to understand. At its core, this legendary book, it's basically a job application. Now, really, part political manual, part desperate plea for his country, sure, but really, it was Machiavelli trying to get back in the game. So the real question is, how on earth did a 500-year-old resume turn into the go-to guide for power, politics, and, let's be honest, the darker side of all of us?
Right, so to really get this book, you've got to get the guy and the world he was living in. This wasn't some academic just, thinking big thoughts in a comfy chair. No way. The Prince was born out of total chaos, a crisis that was both deeply personal and national.
And here you can really see the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, you've got a personal crisis. The guy just needs a job. He was a big shot and then he got kicked out. Simple as that. But on the other hand, there's this massive national crisis. Italy was a total mess, fractured, weak, constantly being invaded. So the book was his big play to solve both problems at once. It's like he was saying, hey, Medici, here's a foolproof plan to save Italy. And, oh, by the way, I'm the perfect person to help you pull it off.
I mean, this timeline really shows you how fast things went south for him. Before 1512, he's a senior official, a diplomat, he's important. Then boom, the Medici family comes back, and he's not just sidelined, he's out. He even gets thrown in prison for a bit. So it's from this place of rock bottom, of total desperation in 1513, that he writes this thing. He's offering up the only valuable thing he has left, his brain, his knowledge of how power really works.
Okay, so now we get to the heart of it, the foundation for all the shocking, ruthless advice that made Machiavelli's name a synonym for cunning. It all comes from one single, incredibly powerful and, deeply cynical idea about human nature, about all of us.
And there it is. Humans are fundamentally wretched creatures. Ouch. But for Machiavelli, he wouldn't call this pessimism, he'd call it realism. He basically said, look, if you try to rule based on some fantasy of how people should be, you're going to fail, period. A smart ruler governs based on how people are. And in his book, that means, well, wretched.
And he's not just being vague here. He gets really specific. He says we're ungrateful, fickle, we're liars, deceivers. We'll run from anything dangerous, but we're super greedy for profit. To him, we're all just self-centered and totally unreliable. That's the worldview. That's the lens for everything that follows.
And if you need just one quote to blow your mind and nail down his whole philosophy, this is it. Men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. Patrimony, by the way, just means their inheritance, their property. Think about that. He's literally saying you'd get over your own dad's death faster than losing your money. It's an absolutely brutal take, but it perfectly shows his belief that at the end of the day, self-interest is what really drives us.
Okay, so if you accept that premise, that people are basically wretched and self-serving, what do? How do you possibly lead a group of people like that? Well, this is where the theory ends and the playbook begins. This is where Machiavelli gets down to the practical and, often ruthless advice.
Let's kick things off with his most famous question, right? Is it better to be loved or feared? For Machiavelli, this isn't even a debate. It's a no-brainer. Love, he says, is flimsy. It's a bond that people will break the second it's inconvenient for them. But fear? Fear is different. Fear is based on the dread of punishment, and that doesn't go away. It's just a more reliable tool in the toolbox. So the verdict is crystal clear. It is way, way safer to be feared.
But, and this is a really big but that people often miss, there is a line, a massive line you cannot cross. A prince must be feared, but he has to avoid being hated. Why? Because fear keeps people in check. Hatred makes them want to overthrow you. And his rule for avoiding hatred is actually pretty simple. Don't take people's stuff and don't mess with their families. As long as you leave their property and their honor alone, you can maintain fear without tipping over into hatred.
So to survive in this crazy political jungle, Machiavelli says a ruler has to be part beast, actually two beasts. You need to be both the lion and the fox. You need the lion's brute force to scare off the wolves, your enemies. But just being strong isn't enough, because a lion can walk right into a trap. That's why you also need to be the fox who is cunning and smart enough to see the traps before they spring. One without the other is useless. You gotta be both.
And here's a perfect, if chilling, case study of how this works. Machiavelli's poster boy for a great prince was this guy, Caesar Borgia. So Borgia has a problem, a chaotic, rebellious region. Step 1, he sends in a cruel but super effective henchman to crack down and restore order. The guy does the dirty work. Step 2, the pivot. Once the region is pacified, what does Borgia do? He has his own henchman publicly and brutally executed, cut in half in the town square. The result is genius in a terrifying way. The people are relieved the cruelty is over. All the blame gets pinned on the dead guy. And Borgia comes out looking strong and just. He's feared, for sure, but he's not hated. It's political theater at its most brutal.
All right, let's talk about another huge part of Machiavelli's world, appearances. For him, politics is basically a performance. It's a stage, and the prince has to be the best actor in the whole production. What you see is definitely not what you get.
So this raises a pretty basic question of leadership, right? Should a ruler always keep their promises? Is their word their bond? You'd think the answer is yes, right?
Well, Machiavelli's answer is a hard no. Absolutely not. And his logic loops right back to his core belief about people. Since men are liars who won't keep their word to you, why on earth should you keep your word to them? He thinks it's not just naive to always be honest, it's political suicide. This is what he called having two faces. On the outside, how you must appear. You've got to be the whole package, compassionate, faithful, kind, religious. You have to look like the perfect, virtuous leader. But behind the scenes, how you must be prepared to act is a completely different story. You have to be ready, at a moment's notice, to be cruel, deceitful, and ruthless, if that's what it takes to protect the state.
And why does this whole act work? Because, as he says, the common people are always impressed by appearances and results. Most of us, he argues, judge by what we see on the surface. We don't dig deeper. If the leader looks good and things seem to be going okay, we don't question the methods. Appearance and results, that's the whole game.
So, a smart prince can control his people, he can control his image, but what about the stuff nobody can control? You know, the curveballs life throws at you, the random chaos that can wreck everything. Machiavelli had a name for that. He called it fortune. He talks about fortune almost like a goddess, or maybe a raging river. It's this wild, unpredictable force that's responsible for all the things you just never see coming. And he believed this force, this luck or fate, controlled a huge chunk of everything that happens. But, and this is key, he wasn't a fatalist. He didn't think we were just helpless puppets. He put it at about 50-50. Fortune controls maybe half of what happens, but the other half, that's on us. That's our free will, our skill, our preparation. To use his river analogy, you can't stop a flood from coming, but you can build dams and levees to prepare for it. So, when faced with this chaos, what's the right move? Be careful? Cautious? Nope. Machiavelli says it's better to be bold, to be impetuous, to grab the situation by the horns and force your will onto it. He uses this famous and very of its time analogy that fortune is like a woman who is won over by aggressive, bold men, not cautious ones. The takeaway is clear. When things get crazy, don't wait. Act. Which brings us to the big question that people have been debating for 5 centuries. Was Machiavelli a realist? Was he just a guy who had the guts to write down the ugly, uncomfortable truth about how power and people actually work? Or was he just a deep-down cynic, whose dark view of the world was just an excuse to justify doing terrible things? Where you land on that, well, that probably says as much about you and the world we live in today as it does about him.